and also that knowledge flows. It moves across borders of different kinds. So I think that then brings us to some interesting questions, which I hope you find interesting too. I became aware of how important this was when I was working with statisticians who were trying to explain to me how they moved from a set of findings to a set of recommendations. And it's a very, very interesting process which is highly governed by precedent. So if a correlation had significance previously, it has significance in the new situation. And there are all sorts of established protocols around this. Now, what becomes interesting is when those things get challenged by new ways of gathering data, of new ways of thinking about relationships between different sets of data, and there isn't guidance from the past. At that point, what happens? Who is influential in saying, in constructing the policy report, that it's really important to connect particular indicators of social class deprivation and educational performance? And it's the technocrats who do that. They make the selections on the basis of their expertise. The policymakers don't see those workings. Right? So there's a practical interest, and there's a practical interest too in explaining and working with professionals who are working with those exact same processes, but at the level of performance testing or inspection or what have you. Okay? So scientific first, but then, the scientific interest leads to a particular set of inquiries that are to do with who's got the power here, who is actually deciding how this will work. Yeah? Is that okay? Right. So, questions. What forms of knowledge and expertise are valorized? What forms are excluded? Experiential and embodied knowledge, I think, just disappears. Who gets to enter into governance roles? Who is seen as bearers of relevant knowledge and expertise? We'll come through this. What are the conditions in which new knowledges, skills, and roles may flourish or not? So you see how my initial point, I hope, leads us to these questions. This is how I'm trying to model, so I'm not the best person to do modeling, the shift that you make from an overarching idea into a set of questions that you can actually go out and try to answer. So in a moment I'm going to turn to some of the evidence that we've accumulated in these different projects. Are there any other points anyone would like to raise on that initial exposition? Yeah.
During your field work, how many times you find some political choices justified as a technical choices?
So you're asking how many times in the field work we see political choices justified as technical choices?
Yes.
Yeah.
For example, when they choose some variables to define some indicators or something like that.
Choosing particular variables to defend a choice. Absolutely. When one talks about breakages, changes, shifts in knowledge, I should be always more cautious. One gets carried away by the new. The new always sits on top of the sedimented old practice. And yes, we certainly found, talking to policy analysts, statisticians, the best access we had was with the Scottish Government. And they would show us how they were moving from the raw data to the recommendation. And very often it was still past practice that determined it, because the thing worked out nicely. They would know that they would get a good, persuasive, convincing correlation if they used particular factors. But of course, at the same time, there was a next stage. So they would produce the statistical data in a simplified form talk to the policy analysts, who are not necessarily the same as the statisticians, and decide how this message could be conveyed to the policymakers in ways that the policymakers would receive. So there's a whole lot of processes going on between the raw data and the acceptability of the policy recommendation, which of course is framed by the analyst's knowledge of what the policymaker will understand, how far they're interested, and how far it aligns with their priorities. So yeah, lots of intervention processes. Yep.
Yeah. And regarding your first question, I'm wondering if it's interesting to add another question about valorization of knowledge and expertise. What are the processes through which knowledge and expertise being valorized?
Yeah, I think actually I'm coming on to that, so maybe I should move on, otherwise I won't get through everything. Well, I won't get through everything anyway. So here I'm drawing on the Knowledge and Policy project, which some of you may know about. There is a spectacularly complex website, knowandpol.eu, which it's a very good research training to try and navigate that website. I won't be rude about it anymore because Eric Manger will be here shortly, and he was one of the principal investigators and did an enormous amount of work on this project. But it was a very big project with 11 countries, European Commission funded. They wanted us to tell them what the best way of aligning knowledge and policy might be. Well, you know, that's going to be a complex undertaking with a pretty difficult endpoint. I'm sure you can see that that would be predictable. But we did do a lot of really interesting work. And it is there in the website if you dig for it. There's quite a lot about political actors and their backgrounds, their training, what they know, which with retrospect I can see now is really interesting. But at the time of doing the project, we were just so busy trying to get to the next work package, we couldn't actually think about it. And that's another interesting thing in relation to knowledge production. You know, when you're doing research, you haven't time to think. But we managed to put together some fairly stable findings that we feel operates quite well as a heuristic tool. I'm not saying that these conditions apply to all of the countries that we studied in Europe equally. And again, remember that new developments are always accompanied by the old. The old doesn't vanish as the new enters. But we were able to construct, as a device for thinking, the notion that we were talking about a post-bureaucratic condition, more advanced in some situations than others. We were looking, again, thinking about governing. How is governing organized and formed? These flexible shape-shifting ideas I've mentioned earlier. So we were looking at particularly how the nation state was now giving way to lots of different possible focal points of governing practices, that hierarchies and formal regulation were giving way to these more diverse actors in more informal constellations, that the dominance of policy professionals was giving way to different kinds of actor, including actors who defined themselves as consumers of services or who came from a third sector, a voluntary sector, from NGOs, that they were not anymore defined by the nation state. They defined themselves, and they were much more fluid in their organization. They moved across national boundaries. And in the past, bureaucracies functioned through norms and rules, but now we argued there was much more functioning based on knowledge and data. Yeah. So that was our our way of thinking about what we were seeing in these different spaces, at different speeds to different extents, of course. And our argument then was, if these organizational forms, these governing forms, are shifting, how does knowledge shift? Can we see parallel changes in knowledge, and can we see connections between the knowledge and the governing form? And we thought we could. And again, thinking about this as just a way of thinking, not a real reflection of the situation in all spaces. We saw a movement from the dominant form of legitimated knowledge to all sorts of claims to legitimacy, different kinds of legitimacy, different kinds of know-how. A move accompanying that away from very closely defined boundaried knowledge holders, usually in the academy, towards many more recognized knowledge holders. A move away from disciplinary knowledge to, this is my old colleague and friend's constantly repeated statement, whatever works, whatever works, we'll do it. Kinds of knowledge that's usable, knowledge, importantly, that you can audit, knowledge that you can translate easily into practice, that has the levers for action included in it. Knowledge that's fast, doesn't get locked up in silos within disciplinary boundaries with the academic profession, but is out there, moving around, and very easily shifted. Yeah? So those are the two interconnected ways in which we saw knowledge and governing changing, but changing interdependently, changing towards making a space into which data could enter as a very active agent. Yeah. What am I doing? I think I'm going to move a little bit more quickly. I was going to give some background on the knowledge economy, but you heard about that and you know about that, so it's just to say that the focus on knowledge, of course, is not unrelated to the whole notion that we now need knowledge more than we need anything, and that our economic well-being, as well as our social and political good, is based on a knowledge economy, knowledge society paradigm. I'll move over that.